Hi guys, it's Paula and I hope you are doing well. By now, most of you know that for Pan That Palette this year, I was doing the Kicking It Old School theme that the Fantastic Ladies decided on, but I also decided to do a side hashtag called Better Together, which is a theme that I created. And during the introduction for Pan That Palette on January 1st, I mentioned that I was having a really difficult time deciding on my palette in the end, or my palettes in the end, because I had come up with some good options. And several of you mentioned that you would be interested in seeing what those combinations were. And then I started doing my inventory, and over the course of pulling every palette out from my inventory, I found more combinations that I really liked. So I figured this would just be a fun video to show you some of the pairs that I came up with over the last month that I thought would make good candidates for Better Together. I suppose, in theory, if I could finish my current duo for Better Together, I could bring in a new pair. That's probably not going to happen, even though I only am working on 2 quads, because I am one of the slowest panners on earth. But a girl can dream. If you're interested in seeing what other combinations I came up with for Better Together, stick around. Okay, so let's start with the other 2 that I was deciding from in January. I will show you what they are, and then we'll go into some of the other combinations I made up while I was doing my inventory. Before we get started, I should probably remind you of what I mean when I say Better Together. The theme Better Together was created based on the idea of bringing 2 palettes together that are good on their own, but even better together. And that could either be because maybe one is all cool tone shades and one is all warm tone shades, or one is very neutral and one is very colorful, or one is very shimmery and metallic and one is very matte. Or maybe you have a palette that you've panned all your favorite shades and you're left with some shades that you're not, you're trying to get through the second tier of shades that are a little harder to get through, and you need a second palette to bring some fresh life into it. So that's the concept behind Better Together. I should have probably stated that from the start. Okay, let's move on to the Better Together pairs. The first combination that I want to talk about are these 2 right here. They're both similar as far as the number of pans. There are more pans in the Moon Dust palette than the Urban Decay Naked palette, but they're comparable. They're both from Urban Decay. One is very shimmery, one is all matte, I think it's almost all matte. Either way, I think they would go well together. Let me open them up for you so you could see for yourself. Okay, I'm gonna have to be careful with this one because the black is cracked. The black cracked. But here they are. Oh my gosh, don't even look at my messy table. There they are right there. In this Naked palette, the first shade here called Venus is shimmery, but the rest of the shades are all matte. I think they would make a nice like base. And then you could pop on the Moon Dust shadows on top and just, are you seeing anything? Yeah, you could pop up the Moon Dust shadows on top of them and get what I would consider to be a complete look. As you can see, I did hit major pan on one of these shadows. So another reason why I was seriously considering this combination is that I would like to finish this pan off and get a point for my low buy, because I've done a lot of the work already and I think it wouldn't be impossible for me to finish off that shadow. So I thought, well, if this is my Pan That Palette combination, I can get another win for the low buy and keep going from there. But I also think that these 2 are definitely better together. I just don't see myself reaching for either of these palettes alone, and I don't think I've ever done that. So the only way I see myself reaching for either of these palettes is if there's something else to go with it. Something a little bit more colorful or shimmery for this palette and some more basic neutrals for this one. So for obvious reasons, I think they are better together. And I am so relieved to close this up because it was making me very nervous. Okay, this next combo was the one that almost stole the show for Pan That Palette this year. I was really torn. Here they are right here. This is the e.l.f. Mad for Matte Summer Breeze palette over here. And this is a Lorac little palette called Champagne Dreams. And I almost went with this for Pan That palette. I just love the shades, especially this one and this one. Like really, I probably bought this entire palette for those two shades. It still takes me back to when the Pantone color of the year was Marsala. Do you guys remember that? I fell in love with makeup that year. That was kind of the year that I went gaga for YouTube and the makeup community. And I still like am always drawn to those kind of Marsala colors that were the Pantone color of the year that year. But obviously this is an all matte palette and I rarely wear all matte looks. And this Lorac Champagne Dreams palette is just kind of blah. Like you guys know Lorac quality is really good. And these are good shades, but I don't look at this palette and feel inspired to put it on my eyes. And I think if I combined this palette with these more interesting shades, it would make a much more wearable eye look for my style. This is not all shimmer, but out of the 7 shades in this palette, it looks like only 2 are matte. 5 are shimmer and 2 are matte. And this is all matte. But yeah, I almost went with this for my Pan That palette for this year. It was down to like the minute before I hit record that I decided to go with the 2 quads instead. Okay, let's move on to some of the palettes I made while I was doing my inventory this year. Here are 2 more quads that I think would go really well together. One is all matte, one is all shimmer. That is a common theme you will see here, although it's not the only theme. It's one that definitely gets me because I do like to combine matte and shimmer. But this Physicians Formula quad in Quartz Quartet, say that 5 times fast, is, you know, nice quality shadows. I bought this quad because Emily Noel raved about it, but there is nothing about this quad that makes me want to pull it out of my drawer and put it on my eyes. But I think if I paired it with this quad from the Body Shop, and I'm using the term quad loosely because these are basically like 4 little single cubes. But I think in combination, these 2 would make a much more wearable or approachable palette, something I would want to reach for. And I think they complement each other very well. They're both pretty cool tone. They both have a little bit of kind of rosy colors to them. They both have a little bit of gray. And yeah, I think this would be a nice combination. And whether it ends up in a project like Better Together or not, I think I should remember to pair these 2 together for some looks and see what I can get because I really think they complement each other very nicely. Okay, I have another set of 2 quads. I mean, technically they're 2 4-pan palettes, but one is not eyeshadow. Let me start with the first one. The first quad that I discovered, and I knew I needed to find a pair for it, is this right here. This is the Lime Crime Plushies palette in Fresh Squeezed. Oh my gosh, I love this palette so much. I don't own a lot of bright eyeshadows. I have some, but this is special to me. I really like this, and I love all 4 of these shades, but they are all matte pressed pigments. They're not, when I look at these shades, I look at them as individual singles, not as something I would use to create a whole eye look. I look at them as super fun pops of colors that I can add to an eye look. And I could definitely see myself using 2 of these shades in an eye look, but I don't necessarily look at this palette and see it as a standalone palette for me and the way I wear makeup. I might throw the hot pink in my crease, or I might do a look with this shade called Mango, which is like the best shade ever. It doesn't look like much compared to these amazing bright colors, but this Mango shade is my favorite shade out of the whole palette. So I knew I needed to find a partner for this guy, and what I ended up with was a highlighting palette. And I think the 2 would work really well together. This is the Northern Lights holographic palette from Makeup Mecca. And these shades are super bright. They're not necessarily the kind of colors that I would reach for face. Now this one up here, this peachy one, I would totally put on my face, but this blue, this yellowy green, and this bright pink are more eyeshadows for me than face powders, at least in 2023. But I think they would pair really well together with this palette. What do you think? So that's my pairing for these 2. Okay, Working my way up the ladder, I now have a 6-pan palette and an 8-pan palette that I think would be really good combinations for better together. I knew I had to find a pair for this guy right here. This is my Jouer Skinny Dip palette. This is all shimmers. I love this palette very much, but I don't think I would use this palette on its own. I mean, I suppose in theory, I might do just an all over shimmery look from like, you know, lashes to brows and just go for it. But for the most part, this is going to be an amazing shimmery glow effect for my eyelids. And I would feel the need to put some beautiful mattes in my crease and lower lash line to make these shadows really work for me. So I knew I needed to find a matte palette to complement this guy. And the one I came up with is this Pure palette. This is the Pure Soul Mattes. They're Soul Mattes. It is a rosy toned palette. And again, this is another one that I heard about through Emily Noel. She sure likes her matte palettes, doesn't she? But again, I bought it because she said it was great, and it is great, but I never reach for it because it's an all matte palette. But I think, you know, if I paired these two together, now, even though there's a lot of rosy shades, there is still this pretty like warm brown, warm or like orangey brown. And, you know, there's a pink in here and a silver. And I just think these two could really work together nicely. I don't know. What do you think? I think they're a good pairing. And I like the idea of 6 pans and 8 pans. Kind of being, I don't think I would pair together like a 20-pan palette with a 5-pan palette. They need to be like kind of on the same level as far as size for me to consider them better together. All right, it is another matte and shimmer combo. One is a 5-pan palette and one is a 6-pan palette. They are these two right here. This is the e.l.f. Prism eyeshadow palette in Sunset. And this is the Urban Decay and Kristen Leanne Daydream eyeshadow palette. If I'm not dropping a brush, it's not a Paula video. Here they are. I think the reason I felt like this palette would go so well with the Kristen Leanne one is that pretty like corally orangey shade in the middle. If it wasn't for that one shadow, I probably wouldn't have paired these two together. But I think that because of that orangey corally beautiful shade, this palette is perfect. A perfect companion to this palette. All shimmer, all matte. I like it. I like combining shimmer and matte. That's definitely a strong theme with these pairings, but I definitely think they would work better together. Have I said that enough? I don't know. And I didn't want to leave my other e.l.f. Prism eyeshadow palette out. This is the one called Naked. So I found a palette to go with this one too. This is another 6-pan Prism palette, and it is all just beautiful bronzy neutrals. And this dark one is pretty dark and this light one is pretty light. There's a nice range from light to dark, but they are all very, very neutral. And the palette that I thought would go really well with it is the Too Faced Natural Matte palette, which looks like this. And I just think, they were made for each other. This is a 9-pan palette. This is a 6-pan palette. But I think they are really well suited for each other. We only have 2 more. And believe it or not, these last 2 were not paired together because one palette is all matte and one palette is all shimmer. So we're changing it up a little. While I was doing my inventory, I was looking at my 8-pan palettes, and the more I looked at them, the more I saw 2 that just seemed to naturally complement each other, because one was super duper bold and bright and the other one was a little bit too muted. And I just felt like the bold and bright palette could use some muted colors to kind of tone it down, and the muted palette could definitely use some bold and bright to breathe some life into it. And they both have quite a bit of green in them. And they are right here. These are the two palettes that I thought would go really well together. This is the Alamar Cosmetics Reina del Caribe palette, and this of course is the original Wet n Wild Comfort Zone palette. And yeah, this is a beautiful palette on its own. It certainly can stand on its own. I've done eye looks using just this palette, but I also feel like it's really bright. And if I was looking to pan this palette for an entire year, I might want some of these more subdued shades at different times throughout the year. But then again, when I look at this Wet n Wild Comfort Zone palette, it just kind of looks a little bit boring. And I feel like this Alamar palette would definitely breathe some life into the Wet n Wild palette. And I think they're better together. Plus they both have green-ish, aqua-ish colors. And this last duo came together under very similar circumstances. I was laying out all of my 10-pan palettes, and the more I kept looking at these two palettes, I kept thinking, you two would be better together. And let me open them up. Let me show you them from the outside, because even the outside looks better together. This is the Urban Decay and Kristen Leanne palette. Again, this one's called Kaleidoscope Dream. And this is a Lorac palette called Afterglow. And even just looking at these two together, I just think from the outer packaging, they just coordinate so well together. I just like the way they look together from the outside. But when I show you the inside, I think you will see. Now, the Kaleidoscope palette, the Kaleidoscope Dream palette is mostly shimmer. And the Lorac palette does have some nice mattes. So that's another reason. But let me get this brush out before it falls on the floor. Look at these two palettes together. This Urban Decay palette has a matte black and a matte orange. A matte black and a matte orange. And everything else is super duper metallic. This Lorac palette has a shimmery gold and a shimmery kind of bronzy rose gold. And this lighter aqua shade looks like it has a little bit of shimmer. And maybe this pinky shade down here. But everything else, it's about half shimmer and half matte. But everything compared to this Urban Decay palette is really subdued. So in this case, I definitely think both of these palettes could stand alone, but I think they're better together. And I would be more interested in working with both of them with the other palette alongside of it rather than each of these palettes individually. So while I was doing my inventory, I realized once I got beyond those 10-pan palettes, I started seeing palettes that needed a companion less and less. Once you get to 12-pan palettes and above, you really are going to find palettes with, you know, cohesive looks throughout. And it's a little harder to find. It's a little more difficult to match pairs together because really the palettes can stand alone much better once you have 12 pans or more. So I did find it a lot easier or motivating to pair these little guys together with like 10 pans and under. But I had a ton of fun doing this. It was a lot of fun. And I'm so glad that so many of you have been enjoying this project theme as well. I'm just amazed by how many people also decided to go along with this theme this year as well. And I'm just loving it so very much. So I hope you had fun looking at some of the other pairs that I've made from my makeup collection for Better Together. I certainly had a ton of fun making them. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.